There's a new case calling itself high airflow on the market, and we all know what happened last time a case did that. The Corsair Crystal 680X is the new larger sibling to the 280X, a micro ATX case that we reviewed back in June. The similarity in appearance is pretty obvious, and Corsair has done this multi-compartment design before, but Corsair has used the past year to make some pretty significant changes. The result is something more than just a scaled up 280X, and perhaps closer to a Lian O11 Dynamic. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and its Straight Power 11 series power supplies. The Straight Power 11 PSUs ship from 450 watts up to 1000 watts, accommodating most of the gaming PC build requirements you'd encounter, and focuses on delivering a higher quality power supply that doesn't sacrifice on efficiency or stability. Noise is also a heavy point for the Straight Power 11, using a 135mm Silent Wings 3 fan that can spin as low as 200 RPM for quieter, low-load operation. Learn more at the link in the description below. This is the Corsair 680X. It's actually a pretty interesting case, and we do like a lot of things about it. There are some pretty serious criticisms as well, as always, but this case strikes a good balance of things it does well and things that it really didn't do well, just depending on what angle you're looking at it from. So the case itself, let's get the basics out of the way, it's $250. So it is a very expensive, that's US pricing, very expensive case. It has 4 fans with it. We'll talk about all the internals and stuff like that in Patrick's build notes momentarily, and the thermals. But at $250, that's a pretty big wall for a lot of people. So instantly narrows the market. The case competes then the most directly with something like the Cooler Master H500M. That would be the high-end one with either glass or mesh in the front, the 200mm ARGB fans. We reviewed that previously. Different models of the C700P also from Cooler Master. To some extent, the NZXT H700i, although the H700 can be had for about $150, so quite a bit different in price there. And also some of the high-end Fantex cases, like the Evolve X without the dual system kit. That's about $200. So it's in that range, that market of cases. And the 680X here, Corsair has made some pretty serious improvements over the 280X. Now, they're different markets. One's micro ATX, one isn't. But the case body is pretty similar. And because of the history with the Corsair 280X, the company has been able to pick up and improve on something. So it's still a case that is fundamentally limited by the style of the front panel, which is one of the major defining features of both the 280X and the 680X. Without any serious reworking of the case, there's not really a great way to get air past that decorative glass front panel, something we'll talk about later. But Corsair did improve, if you like the height, for example, here. It can go taller. You can take these standoffs off technically, but there's really no reason to do it. You just kind of hinder the airflow. So it's a bit taller here. That's beneficial. And other than that, this case is really aiming to compete in at least looks and function with the O11 Dynamic, which is very much the same type of case. It's dual compartment. It is a sort of stout glass tower, but the O11 Dynamic comes in at about $130 if you can find it in stock. So that is a major downside. It's sold out basically always. Doesn't include fans, but you still include fans for the same price, for under the price of this case. And it is water cooling focused. So a few differences between them. The O11 Dynamic is a case that takes the cleverest parts of the 680X, like putting the power supply and the other components in a separate spacious chamber, but avoids the worst part by doing fan mounts on the front instead of the side. The 680X has really spacious cable management area in the back, so that's a huge upside. Corsair's done well there to give you all the room you want to work with. The power supply, the hard drives are compartmentalized on the backside as well, and this is just something Corsair's been doing for years and years now and isn't new. So let's go through Patrick's build notes, hit the thermals and noise section, and then talk about the value of the system. First is the door, which is a step up from the old version. Instead of 4 thumb screws, the panel is set on hinges and held shut with a magnet. This is better looking and a better functioning option. It'd be nice to have a way to lock the door in place even more securely during transportation, but that's a minor issue and systems of this size rarely move anyway. Removing the front panel is a more elaborate process than usual, but it's also unnecessary. The filter and fans are both mounted on a removable tray, and everything else is easily accessible through the side of the case. Fan trays or radiator brackets, or whatever you want to call them, are always an improvement and make for easier management and make it quicker to move or mount and dismount multiple fans. If for some reason the panel does need to be removed, it involves removing 3 screws from inside the case, popping the plastic section off, and removing a further 4 screws from outside. The plastic half is held on by metal clips that function the same way as the plastic clips in the 280X, but are easier to release. Despite appearances, the glass pane is still not intended to be slid out, although it could be freed from its frame by removing many more screws. Space is plentiful, with the power supply, drives, and cables all stuck into the side compartment, which also makes extra room on 3 sides of the motherboard for large cable cutouts. This is especially helpful at the bottom, where intake fans could be mounted without a power supply or shroud to get in the way. That said, cable management could be better. There are cable tie points inside the compartment, but they're too narrow to easily accept Velcro straps. The 280X was small enough that just providing a place to stuff the cables was enough, but the 680X deserves a better thought-out solution, like some integrated straps or larger loops. There are a lot of drive bays, but the structures are pretty flimsy, and one of the 3.5-inch drive sleds in our sample came loose in shipping. Not really a big deal, but worth note because it's not the most secure in the system. They are toolless designs, but they could be sturdier. No major points off for this one though. The top glass panel has an extra layer of standoffs stacked on top, so there's an air gap of about 17 millimeters between the glass and the chassis, as opposed to about 5 millimeters in the original 280X. The standoffs can be shortened to bring the glass closer to the body of the case, but there's really no reason to do that. The top panel isn't removable as one big section like it was in the 280X, but that wasn't a helpful feature in the 280X since there was another steel plate underneath, so it doesn't count as a downgrade. Under the glass section of the 680X's top panel is a large empty gap with fan mounts for 2 120mm or 140mm fans, and the filter is packed separately. That's a good move when it comes to our testing, since stock numbers won't be affected by an unnecessary top filter. But it's still there if anyone needs it. Both the front and top filters are simple magnetic mesh rectangles, but they're inset into the surface of the case in a way that's more thoughtful than usual. Both fit flush with their respective fan cages and are sandwiched between them and the chassis. The bottom filter is mounted on a plastic frame that ejects from the side of the case on the same side as the glass door, so everything should be easy to access and clean in situ. The 680X comes with 4 fans. 3 front intake and 1 rear exhaust. That's plenty, and they're placed where we would have chosen to put them, so additional tests were limited to removing the entire front panel and moving the bottommost intake fan underneath the right side of the GPU to see if it would benefit it more, although we're splitting the airflow a bit there and hedging our bets with some of it going around the card and up to the CPU. We're starting thermals for just the 680X now, and then we'll add more comparative results momentarily. The torture test raised CPU temperature to 58.6 degrees Celsius in the stock configuration. Removing the front panel had a large benefit, lowering the sound to 50.3 degrees Celsius over ambient for a reduction of about 8 degrees. Brute forcing airflow with 3 intake fans is fine, but the case would be much better cooled without a decorative pane of glass suffocating them. The filter is even entirely independent of the glass panel, so it could be torn out and the case would be just as well filtered and function better. That said, you can still have your glass and eat it too, or well, maybe don't eat the glass, but you get the idea. A bit more spacing or more even inlets spaced across the entire front panel would reduce this delta meaningfully. Aesthetics are a valid concern, but it's frustrating to see an 8.5 degree dip just from removing a completely decorative panel. Placing the bottom intake fan under the GPU may have helped the CPU temperature a little as well, but not outside of the range of variance. It would make sense since normally it only blows under the GPU, but when it's mounted at the bottom of the case, it can blow some of the air up towards the CPU as well. So of course there is marketing this as high airflow, as they did in their email to us, then it is misleading marketing at best. This is very much a situation of the H500P original case where it's called high airflow, but it's not. Comparatively, 58.6 degrees Celsius is about as warm as cases get on our chart before they enter runaway thermal territory. It's not the worst, but it is placed between the silence-focused Darkbase Pro 900 and the Inwin 303 with half as many fans. The similarly laid out O11 Dynamic with 3 fans is ranked high with an impressive 49.2 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient because Lian didn't bother trying to draw air through a glass panel and instead provided a mount on the side of the case. That didn't technically count as a stock test though, since Lian sent us fans separately and we installed them as we saw fit. Realistically, the O11 Dynamic though is cheaper even when adding fans to the cart and can be made to outperform the 680X readily, although it is smaller than the 680X while still remaining somewhat compartmentalized. Depending on what you're going for, the O11 Dynamic may be the better bet. It just depends on if it's got the size and the look that you want. Compared to other cases, the 680X really isn't impressive out of the box. Some of this has to do with the fan choice or placement, but much of it is that the front panel is a sheet of glass and isn't really spaced out the way it should be. By dropping temperatures around 8 degrees, the 680X would land right around where the Corsair 570X sits, still high up on the charts, which is a glass enmeshed case that uses wide spacing to allow air intakes everywhere. Moving on to GPU temperatures first with just the 680X, GPU delta T over ambient was 52.7 degrees during stock torture testing and dropped to 51.4 degrees with the front panel removed. That's much less dramatic of a change than on the CPU, but only one of the 3 fans is pointed at the GPU and freeing up the airflow, therefore has less of an impact. Moving the intake fan below the GPU rather than in front of it actually sort of raised temperature a bit by 52.4 degrees, although it's close to variance, but not quite. This increase is because it was positioned in the bottom front area, primarily cooling the VRM and then allowing the rest of the air to drift up to the CPU. Positioning the fan towards the backside more would allow more direct GPU cooling. You're forcing air straight into the GPU core area at that point, but it would sacrifice some of the CPU cooling that we were trying to save. Positioning the fan at the bottom of the case allowed some of the air to split to the CPU as opposed to the bottom front where almost all of it goes to the video card. The stock GPU temperature is acceptable. Looking at the comparative chart now, around the performance of the H500i or the Open Air Core P3 by Thermaltake. The bottom of the case is one big vent free of PSU clutter, and the number of fans that Corsair includes with the case means that one of them is fully dedicated to GPU cooling, which is better than most enclosures we review. Again, the O11 Dynamic 3 side fan test isn't exactly stock, but the result was a few degrees cooler than the 680X. GPU temperature during Firestrike was 55.7 degrees over ambient, slightly above the torture test. That's still near the middle of the comparative chart, but on the same level as the lackluster Silverstone PM02. Moving multiple intake fans to the bottom of the case or switching entirely to a bottom-to-top airflow layout would definitely improve GPU thermals, but with the glass panel at the front of the case, CPU temperatures can't afford to be pushed much higher. Blender is used for a realistic single component workload in our testing. CPU temperature with the Blender test rendering exclusively on the CPU was 40.7 degrees, definitely towards the warm end of the chart, and that's pretty high considering we're only running a CPU workload, and it's a realistic one at that. It shares its space with the stock defined C, which comes with fewer fans at 2, and is also a closed-off case. It's not the Meshify. The O11 Dynamic ran at 38.3 degrees delta T over ambient with 3 side fans, a smaller gap than in the torture test, but still a noticeable one. For the GPU render, GPU temperature was 27.7 degrees Celsius over ambient, perhaps on the warmer side of average. The O11 Dynamic did better here again with 25.2 degrees, but there's no meaningful difference between the two. They're functionally the same at this point. Neither GPU nor CPU temperatures reached anything close to their maximums, but it's good to demonstrate that even without heavy synthetic workloads, the hardware is running warmer than it really needs to. Finally, for noise, we measured the 680X at 42.5 dBA. It could certainly run quieter with decreased fan speeds, but there are 4 120mm fans, and the large air gaps around the front panel do very little to muffle the noise generated at max speed. The trouble with all of this is that the Corsair 680X is not particularly quiet, nor particularly effective at cooling, which is odd since it is named the 680X RGB High Airflow, or at least in the email that was sent to us originally. Overall then, Corsair calls this, at least in its reviewer material and in its email, a high airflow case. And this is something we have trouble with, because if it's marketed like that, and it does count as marketing when you're sending reviewers material that potentially shapes the review and what people say in the reviews. If it's marketed as high airflow, it better be high airflow. And the same is true with Be Quiet's cases, for example. So with Be Quiet, the cases are almost always targeted towards being quiet, as the name would suggest. And so when we review those, we talk primarily about noise and about if they can still run at a reasonable temperature. It doesn't have to be the best, just reasonable while being quieter than the nearby competitors. This case isn't going for that angle. It's going for cooling, but it's not particularly competitive in cooling, and also is not competitive in acoustics, which makes it really, for $250, it's just not good value. It's poor execution of the high airflow aspect that Corsair has promoted to reviewers. And so for that, we do have to take significant points off, because if you're going to market it as, or call it high airflow, and it's not high airflow, then the case has failed at what it's being marketed for. The case itself, though, it is high build quality, so we'll give them that. It's got good cable management space. The compartmentalization, for people who like it, is great. We like these compartmentalized cases because they're sort of fun to work with. They're a bit easier. And from a look standpoint, it's not bad either. There's really functional paneling that's easy to work with. So ease of installation features, build quality, Corsair's done a good job. But hitting the marketing target of high airflow, Corsair's done, frankly, a terrible job, because with 4 fans, it is not even as good as a lot of the cases on our bench with 2 fans that are also quieter. Corsair gets an F for hitting the marketing deliverables, but does okay elsewhere. And that just leaves us with price, really. And to say it flat out, give you a really straightforward answer, the O11 Dynamic gets our buy for this. You could buy, in fact, 2 O11 Dynamics for the price of this case and still have a couple bucks left over for fans after you account for shipping and taxes. So for sure, if you're looking between the two, for some reason, if you consider them direct competitors, even though the price doesn't really permit it, then our choice is the O11 Dynamic. It's cheaper, it does similar things, it's got really good airflow potential if you use the right fan mounts, and you can buy the fans for still combined under the price of this case. So that's our go-to for this style of case. The 680X doesn't offend us, it's just that at $250, it's too expensive for what's going on. You can take off the glass front panel. That feels a bit odd. It seems sort of naked when you do that. But as a case still, with the front panel removed, cooling is actually acceptable. It's pretty good on average. It's okay in the worst cases, as opposed to the current configuration where it's bad in the worst cases and you can get it to acceptable. So anyway, too expensive for missing its main marketing target. If Corsair hadn't marketed it at high airflow, then we could be a bit more lenient there. But we have to look at the product for, at some level, what it's designed to do, and it doesn't do what it says it will do. But the rest of it's okay. So just too expensive. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. As always, go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like the one I'm wearing now. This is the chalkboard shirt. I'll see you all next time.